What do you say to people that say that Frank Alexander's not a trustworthy source because stories were changed, that his stories aren't consistent?
That's a great question, and I think that there's a lot of people that genuinely they get confused more about the allegations than they are about the consistency itself. I think sometimes people don't even know what it is that he's supposed to be inconsistent about. And when you get down to it, at the end of the day, the major sticking point about Frank falls on two different avenues. The first avenue is that Frank actually changed his story to implicate Suge and implicate Reggie. When earlier interviews that he had done, he had been very adamant, and I think even in his book been adamant that he didn't believe that Suge had done it. And I say that's the first one. The second thing actually falls more on a detail-specific topic, and that is the issue about whether or not he was told to carry his gun, or whether or not he had his gun, or whether or not he left his gun. There's a lot of focus by the fans on both of those. So what I will do is I'll tell you about the first one more holistically, and then we'll get into the details. Does that sound fair?
Absolutely.
Okay. The first thing about Frank, and of course this goes back to anybody, and even though Frank and I have been friends for going on 17 years now, I met Frank actually right around the time that all of that happened. The big thing with Frank that I want people to understand and people to know is the fact that Frank has a memory like a steel trap. Many times I've been over at his house and I've picked up a pen to use it to write something down, and he'll notice that I actually had moved his pen. It's funny because it almost borders on OCD, to tell you the truth. So it's one of those things where I find it a little amusing when people say that Frank is inconsistent, because Frank, just by Frank being the definition of consistent, everything has to be in exactly the same place all the time. So he has a mind for memories. He has a mind for telling us what day we went to the movies 5 years ago and what we saw, things that I would never remember in a million years this guy comes up with. It's really amazing. So that's part of it. So it's kind of like hard for me sometimes to accept that on principle, because you really got to get to know the guy to understand that a lot of what they're saying about inconsistency is generally kind of off the wrong foot. But speaking specifically about the threats and all that themselves, I mean, consider that, this is what we did in Assassination 2. Frank had mentioned to me at one point that he had threats from death row, and he's alluded to them in his book. He's alluded to them in other things. And it took a little bit of arm twisting for me to get Frank to play the tapes. I wanted him in the first movie, but I finally got him to relent in the second movie. He really didn't want to put him out there, and it wasn't so much the fact that he was concerned about the subject matter. He was more concerned about the fact that he had recorded the calls. And, California law is pretty clear about if your life is threatened or if you're feeling threatened, it's okay to record the call. He didn't know that at the time. He just, for his own safety, was recording these phone calls as they came in. And so it wasn't really even a matter of consistency. But when those tapes were made, I mean, it's real clear. You heard it. I mean, people don't make that stuff up. Death Row wanted him dead. And there's a story that he always tells about going to the house with Suge and with Reggie and sitting there when Suge gets the news that Tupac actually had died, and that story about throwing the phone down and all that. Frank was very afraid because of the unsurety of the situation. That from the day that the whole chain of events that led up to Tupac getting shot, I can say that uncertainty was probably the word of the day for all those days. They weren't sure who was covering Tupac. They weren't sure if they're going to have weapons. They weren't sure if they were going to have walkie-talkies. All of this was just, they just weren't sure. They didn't know, and it was inconsistent. So after Tupac gets shot and eventually dies, there's more of an era of unsurety there. How's this going to play out? How is Suge going to react? What's the word going to be? Then you start hearing right after Tupac gets shot, you start hearing about shootings in Los Angeles, you start hearing about retaliations, you start hearing these things, and I'm a firm believer you can't judge a man until you've walked a mile in his shoes. So to have somebody who's, for us it would be easy to say, well, let's put your friend in a car, pick your best friend or pick your friend that you've been with for a year. May not have been the best friend in the world, but you've known him for a year. Put him in a car, have somebody kill him in front of you, with 10 feet in front of you. Have him die a week later after you think he might pull through, have him die, and then have the people that you may think or may believe had anything to do with him getting shot also wanting you dead. Now tell me that you wouldn't be a little bit erratic. I think that they hold Frank to such a standard, and that's great because Frank's a man of integrity. They hold him to that standard. But then again, I mean, there's nobody else that can actually identify. We can think and we can try to identify with where he's at, but until, like I said, until you're in that situation, it's hard to say how you would act. So that's the general inconsistency. He's running around thinking he's going to get killed. You're going to watch everything you say. If somebody sticks a microphone in your face and says, in your book, you said this and said that, and you look at it and you say, well, yeah, I did, or no, I didn't, and you read, yeah, I did. That whole period of time, probably for 4 or 5 years after Shakur got shot, Frank was in a position where there were people watching, people still he interacted with on a daily basis. Don't forget, he kept working security long after Shakur was killed. And knew all the same bodyguards, and they all kind of gossip, they talk, and word gets around. So whatever you're going to say is eventually going to get back to somebody. And Frank was very concerned about that. He was concerned about his whole security for him and his family. They think they did that Biggie Tupac movie. It shocked me that the filmmaker was so irresponsible that he videotaped driving all the way up the road that led to Frank's house and actually pulled in the driveway with the camera on. And it's like painting a target on on somebody. And I just thought it was really distasteful. So that's kind of the general overall consistency. I don't think anybody has a right to judge anybody about it. The second thing I think, and again, not trying to be an apologist for anybody, but I also believe that you have the right to change your mind, for heaven's sakes. The last time I knew this was a free country. You can believe what you want to believe, and circumstances and facts can change that are presented to you that alter your perception of things. I can tell you with absolute certainty that most of the guards at death row actually thought that Reggie Wright, the extent of Reggie Wright's relationship with Suge Knight, was just that he was the security guy. That's it. They had no concept, no idea or understanding, nor would they, I suppose, that Reggie had any entanglement with Suge other than he was the guy that was hired to provide security. And it was that simple. They just saw it as that simple of a relationship. And in fact, it was a lot more complex and still remains much more complex even today.
On that note, when people speak on Frank's inconsistencies, do you think that people tend to overlook the killings that were in retaliation for the shooting that was happening in Los Angeles before Tupac even passed away?
Yeah, I think they do. I mean, anybody at that particular time, anybody that was affiliated or anybody that even knew about this, it looks like they were dropping like flies. And and whether or not it was retaliation or whether or not it was just random shootings that that they put out as gang-related shootings, Orlando Anderson getting killed at a car wash, 3 days after he makes a settlement deal with the estate. Those kind of things, people are just dropping like flies. And, you have to be sensitive about that. So, there's that. There's also the issue of, what people fixate on. They're fixating on this whole thing about whether or not Frank had his gun or didn't have his gun.